This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. To what extent do we trust the use of data and technology to deliver government services, particularly healthcare? It's an issue that's come under closer scrutiny as we seek to control the spread of the coronavirus. Also, how effective is disinformation as a weapon to destabilise countries, and how far should we expect social media companies to go in helping law enforcement agencies track down criminals online? I'm Damian Collins MP, and I'll be discussing these and other issues with Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who was President of Estonia from 2006 to 2016, a nation which has led the way in online government. He was most recently a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University in California, and also co-chairs the World Economic Forum Working Group, the Global Futures Council on Blockchain Technology. We'll also be hearing from our resident expert, the disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel. So, Toomas, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And when we met previously at a conference at the NATO Stratcom Centre in Riga, we were talking then about disinformation and the role and responsibilities for social media companies to act on that. And I want to come on to that in a few moments. But I wanted to start off firstly by asking about the use of technology in society, because the coronavirus, I think, has brought this issue much more to the front and centre of the public debate in politics, because governments are seeking to create and roll out track and trace apps to help fight the virus. And indeed, in the near future, they may become a permanent part of life as we maybe live with the virus over many years. And when we started to have those discussions, my first thought was thinking back to Estonia and the incredible work that happened under your presidency, and the journey that your country went on in terms of adopting technology at the heart of your democracy and the whole function of government. And I've been interested if you could just give us some insights about the start of that process and how you took the country with you on that journey.
Well, I should say that it began much earlier, and most of what I actually did, sort of hands-on, was done in the 1990s, when I proposed that we computerize and connect all the schools as a first step, which we did. And so by 1998, all Estonian schools were online and had computer labs, and they were open to the public. And the impetus for that really was to get out of the sort of disastrous situation we were in when we restored independence after 50 years of Soviet rule. And I guess the impetus, to go really back, was that in 1938, the last full year before World War II, our cousins to the north, the Finns and Estonia, basically had the same GDP per capita. So far as you can measure it, basically the same level of development. And when we became independent in 1992, the first full year restoration of independence, our GDP per capita Finland's GDP per capita was $24,000 US, and Estonia's GDP per capita was 2,800, which shows you how wonderful communism can be. And stuck with this situation of what are we going to do? How are we going to catch up? And then there were all kinds of ideas. And my proposal was to digitize. And so the first step was computerization of schools and of minimal public services. It became clear by the late 90s that if you really want to do something, and this is really the stumbling block for all countries, is that you need a secure identity. And without a secure identity, you can't do anything. And that a secure identity is one that is unique, tied to a population registry that has two-factor authentication and end-to-end encryption. And most countries have not, especially the Anglo-Saxon countries, have not been willing to take that step, even though, to take the UK example, Francis Maude, when he was government minister, was actually quite impressed when he came to Estonia and wanted to do it, but that whole thing really didn't go far because it got stuck with the ID issue, which is, again, as I said, somehow anathema to the UK and Canada and the United States. In any case, we rolled out a national identity with a chip on it, and that allowed you to basically authenticate yourself as the unique individual that you are, and passed the digital signature law in 2000 that allowed you to perform legal acts digitally. And then we created our own digital architecture for using government services, which has now been copied in one form or another by about 15 countries. And then we rolled it out. And then since then, we have been digitizing or made digital virtually all government services, to the point that there are only 3 acts between the individual and the state that you cannot do digitally, and those are getting married. You have to show up, both of you. Getting divorced, and here again, you both have to show up. And then third, in transfers of property. So if you buy or sell property, you or in the case of companies, a member of the board has to show up, because, as you well know, probably, that sort of anonymous shell companies can wreak a lot of damage and launder a lot of money. So in our country, if you want to buy or sell property, I mean, both halves of the transaction have to show up at least at a notary's office. Anyway, so that, and the digitizations proceeded apace. You can do everything else online, and this, as I said, this is something that has come in extremely handy during the pandemic, because all of the things that you basically do as a citizen, or where you need to do anything with the government, you can do it from home, and people do, and it's not a problem. And including signing contracts and all kinds of things that are not necessarily even with the government, but you can, since we have a legal signature, you can sign contracts. So all of that has made, at least during the past 3 months, life in Estonia somehow a little less cramped than it is in other countries that have not digitized to this degree. So that's the very short version.
Was there ever a question of winning people's trust for this, or was it sort of born out of necessity? People accepted it because it was the most practical way of developing the country. Because, as you rightly say, I think just looking at the UK, I think there's still a concern about, well, do I want the government to have all this data about me? Am I comfortable sharing data in this way? But clearly, in Estonia, that wasn't a problem.
Well, I mean, if you think about, data that the government has anyway. The question is it on paper or is it in digital form? So that was not a problem. There are a couple of incentives, one of which was that if you did your taxes online, you basically could do it in about 3 minutes, whereas if you did it on paper, it took a long time to fill everything out. And on top of that, you were second in line after the digital returns for getting your refunds. And when people saw that it was highly convenient to do these things digitally, then they started exploring other services that we offer, which of course we didn't all roll out at once. We've been rolling them out over time, more or less done took about 10 years to get them all out there. But so the privacy concern, I think, is, people read too much into Big Brother. The thing is that the records that you operate with that are online, be they property ownership, or land registries. I mean, all those things there exist on paper. Someone wants to look at it. And in fact, we have what we have in our country is which I think gives greater privacy, is we have a reciprocal mutual transparency principle, where so that those things, things that other people can look at, you can see who's looking at it. So basically, you think of three kinds of data. I mean, there is the private data, which you have, which say your medical records, which only you have access to, as well as the doctor that you legally authorized to have access. So you give it to your GP, right? And then you have public data, which is open to everyone. In my country, for example, property records are completely public. And then you have the kinds of data that are available to government agencies, but not to the general public. So, for example, your traffic tickets, right? So police can see that if you haven't, if you're speeding and they catch you, they see that, oh, you not only have failed to pay, not only have you exceeded the speed limit, but you also have 17 other tickets. Now, all those things actually they exist in the paper world. The difference is that in our system is that I can also see who's looking at my data. And so in the case of, say, property records, which were public on paper before anyway, but now, I remember during my term in office, of course, journalists always want to see if anyone's bought something and someone in government owns something. So they would always see every once a month they go through all the politicians to see what people know or what people own. And of course, I could also go on and say, well, who's been looking at my property records? Oh, that journalist. That's great. I mean, it's all above board, not a problem. So I'm not so concerned about the privacy issue. I'm much, much, much more concerned when it comes to digitization about data integrity. And here, basically, the difference between, say, privacy and integrity is that if someone sees my healthcare record, say, well, that's kind of obnoxious. And so they publish it, it's probably more obnoxious. On the other hand, if someone changes the record of changes my medical record, it could be fatal. And so one other step that we took beginning in 2007, completed in 2008, is that we have put all critical data on blockchain. It's a private blockchain, so it's not like Bitcoin. That means there are a limited number of authorizing or authorities that have to be checked to change any data. But the point is that these data are secured in ways that even paper data is not. That's in short.
I remember. So, final question on this: when we were in Tallinn with the DCMS Select Committee last year, and we were given the e-Estonia presentation, of which I'm sure you're extremely familiar. The example that was one of the examples that particularly stayed in my mind, I thought, was the way in which if you were a resident of Tallinn, the way you went about getting your transportation card for the city, and to do that, it had to be established that you were a resident there. And to do that, the system didn't require access to your home address, just required proof that you were a resident. So there seemed to be almost some blockchain principles built into the way data was shared, so that only enough data was shared to enable a process to be completed. There wasn't the blanket sharing of all personal data between different systems. And to me, that seemed like a smart way of also trying to gain public trust, so that people could understand how and when their data would be used and how it would be protected?
Well, that was, I didn't go into it, but one of the more complex tasks of digitization, which actually took much longer than the simple technological part, is the regulatory side, which determined who or which agency can have access to which data. And so, I'll give you an example. For example, the government it pays workman's compensation, or say you're injured on the job. Now, in order to do that, the Social Affairs Ministry has to know that you are, in fact, injured on the job. In order to do that, they have access to that part of your healthcare record that is associated with the injury on the job, but nothing else. That's a fairly specific case, but these are the kinds of things you have to think about when you digitize a country, so that determining who has access to what is critical. And the flip side of that is, which citizens love, is the once only rule, which we have also, which is that the government may not ask you for any information it already has. So if I never have to write my address, telephone number, or any of those things, because that exists somewhere, and if it's ever needed, they can find it, but they never look at it either. But it exists already, so you don't do what you do in most places, which is that every form you fill out, every time you do your taxes or apply for something, you have to write out all your personal data on a piece of paper, which, of course, again, is by no means more private than doing it digitally, where it's simply ascertained that you have an address.
So I want to come on now to talk about disinformation. And when we started looking at this in the select committee in our inquiry, particularly in 2018, around the time that the Cambridge Analytica story broke, I remember talking to people from experts from Eastern Europe and from Scandinavia, and it was almost like they were saying welcome to the party, because the idea of state interference through information networks, using disinformation to try and destabilize a country and cause tension between people, was something that countries in the east of Europe and Scandinavia have been living with for some time, particularly coming from Russia. But all of a sudden there was this focus on this in the West, because we'd seen evidence of it during the elections in 2016.
Right.
Do you think we're now looking at the ongoing effect of those destabilizations, that they're not just happening around individual elections, they're happening constantly, and a lot of the tensions and divisions we're seeing played out in streets and cities around the world now are a consequence of the drip effect of this interference?
Well, there are two components. One is, it has massively increased. The other question is, how effective have they been? And I think in terms of disruptive fringe elements, quite effective. In the general discussion, maybe not so much. But to go back historically, we have been, countries in Eastern Europe have been subjected to disinformation in more analog forms, basically since 1989, 1991, both domestically and also in terms of attempting to influence the West regarding us. Clearly when my country was in the negotiation phase to join the European Union and NATO, there were all-out efforts to influence that, both in Western European capitals as well as domestically through paid newspaper articles. But the digital form of this really took off in 2014 with the invasion, occupation, annexation of Crimea. when when the Russians really sort of pushed this again, both within Ukraine, but also at foreign outlets, spreading disinformation about all kinds of events in Ukraine. I remember the BBC fell prey to this by picking up a number of disinformation stories about Ukraine, where they, in the name of the balanced journalism, they say, well, on the one hand, the Ukrainians say this, and on the other hand, the Russians say that, when in fact what they were balancing was utter disinformation with what was really going on. So, and it worked, is the point. I mean, the disinformation campaign against Ukraine was extremely effective, and it raised doubts about what Ukraine was going on in Ukraine. And this was done again in the 2015 Dutch referendum. There was a bizarre thing where, first of all, some people of dubious backgrounds used a loophole or used an element of Dutch law to push through demanding a referendum on the association agreement of Ukraine with the European Union. Now, we have not even had referenda yet on accepting a country as a member, but an association agreement is basically a deep free trade agreement plus student-teacher exchange, and it really is nothing compared to membership. But nonetheless, this was pushed through, and then the Dutch had a referendum, and they were really subjected to disinformation about Ukraine, and ultimately, as we know, that the referendum passed, and Netherlands could not approve an association agreement for Ukraine. So that worked, and then, as we know now, that the efforts after those attempts were stepped up dramatically in Western Europe and in the United States for the referendum in the UK and also in the elections, but elsewhere as well. I mean, you've seen it up to now. I mean, I remember reading a study that when Catalonia and Madrid had their dispute, that two studies, one claimed 84%, the other 93% of inflammatory information on Facebook was done in a collaborative effort by Russia and Venezuela, because the Spanish language knowledge of Russia was not good enough, and so the St. Petersburg troll factory would put out content, and then it would be translated in Venezuela. I mean, there are constant examples of this, and when it comes to, say, the anti-vaxxer movement, we know that this was a lot of disinformation was being spread in Italy. When it came to some NATO, every time there's a NATO exercise, you can be guaranteed that in the country where it takes place, that there will be a heavy dose of disinformation. And now, just today, or is it yesterday, the EU actually issued it could be a lot stronger, but issued a statement on disinformation activities of Russia and China regarding the COVID-19 plus 5G pandemic story. So it's ongoing, and I guess it'll be with us for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Corona has brought the issue into sort of sharper focus for many people, because we're seeing disinformation around a public health emergency, and there are health consequences of that. And indeed, even some of the tech companies, social media companies themselves, seem to be responding to speech in a different way, and actually seeing that speech can cause physical and real world harm. And just a final question from me in this: I wonder what your views were on the debate that's raging at the moment between I suppose, Twitter, Facebook, and President Trump about the extent to which companies should intervene if they feel that speech is not only misleading but could actually lead to harm?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is very tricky. And of course, the First Amendment in of the U.S. Constitution has been interpreted much more robustly than in Europe. So I mean, there are laws in Europe banning Holocaust denial, but that's not possible in the United States. Well, when you start, I mean, I think in the case of political campaigns and public safety or public health issues, that the limited step which Facebook has taken of at least flagging disinformation is absolutely vital. Of course, I mean, that gets very complicated because they're willing to. Facebook has given warnings on campaign material from the Biden campaign, and also a group of Republicans, of Never Trump Republicans, have even had their material taken off, saying it was factually incorrect, but they're not willing to take the step regarding Donald Trump when he spreads falsehoods. So, I mean, this is a kind of a dicey area. Twitter, I think, has been much better by flagging material that they find to be, again, incorrect in a dangerous way. I mean, they're not censoring anything, but they do flag disinformation when it is either regarding an election or a campaign or public health issues, as in COVID-19.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it clearly is different when it's a public health emergency, because there can be some real world health consequences to that too. But I think also it was interesting with the decision Twitter took with regards to the looting and shooting tweet from Donald Trump in relation to the civil unrest in America recently. That then you're going into different territory where you're starting to say, well, the language that a politician is using in this case could be dangerous, could cause real harm. And as we go into the election cycle, the hot period of the election cycle in America, it'll be interesting to see whether there are more interventions like this made, and indeed whether social media gives individuals and politicians in particular the opportunity to broadcast constantly to millions of people around the world, and whether there has to be some responsibility about how that power is used.
Well, yeah, it will be an issue, and it seems that there is a clear divide between Twitter's approach and the approach of Facebook, and I think Facebook is coming out badly in this regard, since it seems that in an effort to avoid regulation by the Republican majority in the Senate and from the president, that they're willing to take a less than balanced view of these things, applying their criteria selectively. Twitter has been better, but I think it's all going to get much worse. And if the election turns out that with a change in government, then maybe this approach of Mark Zuckerberg is not going to be the wisest. So he's gambling, I guess. But we see this. I mean, the thing is that this is taking place in the case of an election, when this activity is stepped up. In the case of, but even without elections, we have this constant, steady stream of things. And whenever there are, with the protests in the United States in the past week, there's quite a bit of disinformation being spread from outside, and apparently both by Russia and China. And I've read that also Iran has had a hand in this, though I don't know how effective they are. The other issue, of course, is that aside from the difference in legal systems between the United States and Europe, let alone other places, that the number of resources that Facebook puts toward finding this information is wildly different in the United States compared to its basically second largest market, which is the United States, which is Europe. I mean, they just don't have that many people on the case, which means that a lot more disinformation comes out. Or perhaps put it this way, it's less likely disinformation will be flagged in Europe than it is in the US.
We have Charles Creel joining us as always, who's
Hi, Damian.
keeps an eye on the world with this disinformation for us. Perhaps at this moment, I could just ask you, Charles, if you could give us an update on what's caught your eye in the last few days.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to pick up on what Toomas just said, Brussels is accusing China of running disinformation campaigns inside the EU. This just happened yesterday, and they're calling it a mass wave of fake news around coronavirus specifically. Now, this is the first time that EU leadership has publicly named China as a source of disinformation campaigning, and they have been accused of soft pedaling on China in the past, so it makes it much more interesting. According to the news statements from the EU executive, Chinese embassy website claimed that EU care workers were abandoning COVID sufferers to die, that 80 French lawmakers used a racial slur against the Ethiopian president of the World Health Organization, and the old perennial lie that there are secret U.S. biolabs in former Soviet states. They've also accused, or rather they made an implicit rebuke against Donald Trump. They said that Belgium's Poison Control Center has recorded a 15% increase in people being poisoned after drinking bleach. They didn't name Trump specifically, but it's clear who they're speaking of. They've also gone on to make recommendations around what the big data platforms can do to stem this flood, and they're very similar to the recommendations made by the DCMS Select Committee, of course. What else has caught my attention came to me through my email this week, as it's Gab, and they're claiming that a new Italian study of social media shows that their platform is free from echo chambers and doesn't subject their users to the kinds of bias experienced on Facebook and Twitter. Gab, listeners will remember, is Twitter for neo-Nazis. We've talked about it before. They claim to be a free speech platform and not only offer a Twitter-like short messaging service, but also a browser plugin that lets Gabbers discuss web pages with other Gabbers, and only Gabbers can see it. And what they claim is that Gab is unmoderated. But this study is Echo Chambers on Social Media, a comparative analysis. And they claim to be precisely that. After a graph analysis of more than 1 billion posts across 4 social media platforms, they offer an evaluation of each of them. And Gab says that in the paper's abstract is the unfortunate quote, while Facebook and Twitter are dominated by echo chambers in all the observed data sets, Reddit and Gab aren't. But what Gab doesn't say is that the authors of the paper go on to show that, to evaluate the 4 social media platforms and show that Gab is a kind of far-right battery farm with a level of extremism that none of the other platforms share, only possibly Reddit, and that's to the left and not quite so extreme. The researchers' claim around echo chambers has far more to do with a feature of curated news feeds than actual content on the platforms. So what Gab is really saying is that because they haven't built an algorithmically driven news feed, meaning they're not providing a feature, they're actually keeping their platform free from bias, which is an interesting claim at best.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that, Charles. Before we wrap up, there's just one final topic I wanted to talk about and ask you about, Toomas. There's been a very interesting story I saw, I think last night, from CNN about a collaboration between the FBI and Facebook and a sort of third-party company to help identify a dangerous offender who was targeting women on the internet, and they managed to exploit a loophole in the privacy settings and the encryption settings of the tools that this offender was using in order to help the authorities identify him and take action against him. And this seems to have caused quite a lot of controversy. I think a lot of people would say, well, that's good. It shows you what the company's capable of, and you can use technology to identify people who are trying to hide who they are and where they are if they're breaking the law. And others have said, well, this is a kind of massive invasion of privacy. Given the sort of the ongoing debate we have at the moment about particularly the use of encrypted messaging services and whether people should be allowed to use those tools to commit offences and what the technology companies can do to intervene, I'd be interested, given your perspective, particularly your work at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, in where you think the ethics of this debate lie, and actually whether it's proper for technology companies to do what they can to help identify and aid the capture of people who are sort of dangerous criminals who are preying on other people.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is just coming out, so this is all preliminary. Apparently, this was so horrendous that Facebook decided they had to do something about it. But in fact, they used a loophole here in that, they hired a separate company to do to find the 0-day exploit with which they managed to track them down, because actually it wasn't in Facebook itself, but rather it was in the Tor channel they were using, this person was using to access Facebook pages so that he couldn't be tracked. Well, there's a whole wide area, and this which also touches upon our earlier discussions when people say, oh, we're worried about government, our privacy and government surveillance. I mean, you recall about 3 months ago, the U.S. doesn't do, there's no government surveillance of people, insofar as the law is concerned. But then ICE, the immigration police, bought data from a private company that was doing surveillance of people to find illegal immigrants and where they're located. So there is, while the concern is about what the government is doing, it doesn't need to do much because there's such a massive degree of surveillance of people by the private sector, which we don't know much about. And certainly I would recommend reading Shoshona Zuboff's book titled Surveillance Capitalism on this. But I mean, your data are just being harvested on everything you do and touch that is remotely digital. And in fact, you don't really need to have a big brother in government if the government can simply buy the data from the big ant or whatever however to call it, big sister, because the tech companies really do have access to huge amounts of information. And so when we get to tech companies, we have the issue of WhatsApp, Signal, and other encrypted forms, where companies like Apple have, with their platform, have been very resistant. Other ones to sort of government requests, others not so much. In the case of the one breaking of encryption of the Apple iPhone, it was again the U.S. government employing or subcontracting it out to an Israeli security company that did this. So this area, I think, is only beginning to be opened up as to what is possible. Because, if we go back to the old days, it used to be that only governments had the capacity and the wherewithal to hack. And GCHQ and NSA were they were the ones you'd always look to for when it came to hacking or when it came to anything really digital. Whereas now today, you don't need that. You don't. The government can just open its purse and buy surveillance information Now, just a few words on the entire encryption debate. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about for the past couple of years is that, of course, yes, encryption is for national security reasons. We need to get into that and all that, but I'm not sure. I mean, if you have a backdoor key in the hands of the government, then the best thing to do if you wanted to really get into people's stuff, if you're a bad actor, is not to is to hack the government. And you don't have to hack the government simply by going into the information data sets that the government has. I was thinking a couple of years ago when I think people in the EU said we should have our own sort of backdoor for EU. And I was going like, well, if I were Vladimir, I would say I would find out who's in charge. I give you $1 billion. $1 billion, give me key, right? And so the authority that is supposed to be responsible for the encryption key could simply be bought. So I think we have to be very wary about encryption keys and who has them and why they should have it. And maybe just one of the things we'll end up having to live with in modern society is that there will be encrypted communication that will be unbreakable, certainly at least for the next 10, 15 years until quantum computing comes on to the point where all of our current encryption becomes completely useless.
Well, that's a cheery thought on which to finish. And I think you're absolutely right about the amount of data that, let alone that governments have, the private companies hold. And indeed, we discussed this with Shoshana on the podcast a few weeks ago, that whilst we're having this debate about the track and trace apps that governments are trying to deploy to work out who's got coronavirus, Google could probably take a pretty good guess anyway, based on the data it's holding on people. And I know something Shoshana had written about before, that it could pretty much guess when a woman was pregnant or whether someone had got the flu based on their activity. But Toomas, thank you so much.
Wait, let me add one thing which you might want to include, maybe not. But on the tracking things, we have a much more fundamental issue coming up, I think, than even the privacy side, which is that Apple and Google are allowing on their platforms one tracking app per country, no others. So if you want to download one, I know, for example, in the case of my neighbor Latvia here, you can get you can download this. They're the first actually to have this operating, but they have to follow certain restrictions set by Apple and Google on privacy, which are more stringent than what they employ in the analog world, and where they actually have physical trackers, asking people, who did you come into contact with? And this becomes a serious issue for a government, since if you are identified as having come into contact with a COVID patient, then you're supposed to isolate yourself. Now, are you going to isolate yourself on the basis of an app? And if this app is someone where the parameters are determined by a private company, not by the parameters set by the laws of the country, where do we stand on that? I mean, we see that Apple and Google kind of hold it over the democratically elected nation states on what can be downloaded from their platforms. I'm not going to wade into this in terms of what's the right approach, but I'm simply raising this as a future dilemma that, existed hypothetically before, in terms of these huge transnational corporations with monopolies on access to apps and their relationship to governments. And as long as everything was in the private sector, it was all fine. But if the criteria and parameters for national governments are set by two companies 10 miles apart in Silicon Valley. So determining what Europeans can do, well, I don't know where that will end up.
I think that's a really good point, and we see this in the UK now because the government's preferred app doesn't appear to be working. They went a separate route, decided not to use the Google and Apple app, and it's not clear whether that's possible. And I think you're right to highlight that effectively Google and Apple can determine which apps which countries can use, and their effectiveness by whether they cooperate with their systems or not. And as you say, that puts a lot of power in the hands of two companies takes away from governments in that regard. But
right.
So, Toomas, thank you so much for joining us from your home in Estonia. It's been a fascinating discussion, which we covered a huge range of topics, and I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer, but we probably have to end at that point. So thank you very much for joining us.
Great, thank you.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Toomas Hendrik Ilves and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.